how important is the gay bar or lesbian bar? And do you think we'd miss it if it weren't here? And some people honestly think there's no need.
You see, Italian-American clubs and German-American clubs, Cuban-American clubs in Tampa, because even though you're accepted in mainstream society in the broader group, you still want to connect with your roots. And that's part of what I think the gay bars community can do. But it's changing the face of the bar, because now you can see people in there, who maybe wouldn't have gone in the bar because they don't like to drink. And they can now go in the middle of the afternoon at 2 o'clock and have a cup of coffee with a couple of friends and feel at home and not feel like they're, being looked down upon for not drinking.
Like, people don't need to have alcohol. They could just pop a half of an edible, and they don't do alcohol, but they might do other things.
As we know, a lot of bars are going out of business.
People were declaring the death of the gay bar because of the hookup apps. Because it's like, oh, you don't need to go out to a bar to meet someone to have sex anymore. You just can stay on your couch, get on your phone and order someone in.
I'm here today with artsmith David Kennerley and Henry Lay, my erstwhile editor. This telecast came about when we were individually chatting, the three of us, and we realized that we each have a lot of knowledge, a lot of trivial knowledge, a lot of important knowledge about different bars and clubs and ways of going out in different parts of the country. And in comparing notes, it became obvious that the three of us ought to get together and talk about gay bars, their state today, where are they heading, what did they mean in the past? As we know, a lot of bars are going out of business. I'll be looking forward to your thoughts in a moment, Art, on lesbian bars that had fallen down for a while and look like they may be coming back. But the point is, they've been with every one of us here for our entire 50-ish years out. In my case, it's actually 58. And they will continue to be here, but in what form? And what purpose and importance will they play in our community? So maybe we start off by going a little bit into the past and saying, when did you each come out? What did gay bars and discos mean to you at that time?
So for me, it was the late 70s. It was 1978. And I had an ongoing relationship with a classmate from high school, who, for all intents and purposes, today we would call a boyfriend. But back then I didn't know that concept, because in my world, there was no gay community. I didn't know that gay men had relationships or anything. It just seemed like an odd experience. I went to visit him at college, and we went out to dinner. And after dinner, we walked across the street and went to a bar. At that time, the drinking age was 18. And we walked in, had a drink, ordered a drink. And after about 5 minutes of looking at the dance floor, I realized that everybody on the floor was male. And that was kind of my revelation that there is a gay society out there of some sort. That was at the Hippopotamus in Baltimore, which was on Eager Street. And it continued to operate until, I think, 2015. So it was around for quite a while. But to me, going there was kind of an affirmation that not only was there a gay world out there, but that it was full of things like you would find in the mainstream world. It was not a dark, dingy hole in the wall. It was a disco. It was a big bar. It was nicely appointed. And I suddenly felt like this was not some kind of underground cult or something. It gave me a sense of belonging and a sense of worth. So for me, it was a big introduction to the fact that, the gay world did exist and had value. And it definitely made a big impression on me moving forward.
Thanks, Art. David, so when did you come out?
So I moved to New York City around 1990 when I was in my late 20s, and I didn't have any friends. I was struggling with my career and my sexual identity, so I still wasn't out yet. But by some sort of divine intervention, I ended up living in Chelsea just as it was becoming the hot new gayborhood in New York City, shifting from the West Village. So my roommate was gay, and for months he'd asked me, David, look, I want to take you to this really great club. It's called the Roxy. It's gay and it's great dancing, and I just want you to check it out. Because I think he knew I was gay before I knew I was gay. So at first I said no. I was kind of afraid to go, but after a year, he finally convinced me to say yes. So we go to the Roxy, which is a big mega dance club. And I have to say, when I walked in, I was gobsmacked. It was this vast, cavernous space filled with hundreds of queer people, most gay men. And I was like, I'd never seen that many queer people in one space. I was like, wait, do you mean to tell me that all of these guys are attracted to men just like me? And they've all been bullied and called faggot over the course of their lives, just like me. And I just felt like I found my tribe. So sort of what Art was saying, like I just felt like this kinship, and I felt like I had a sense of belonging for the first time. So for me, clubs like the Roxy were a lifeline, a safe space, and a catalyst for me coming out.
And what about you, Mike?
Um, I came out in 1976, or began telling people, told my family, told my fraternity brothers, didn't have any gay friends. And I actually felt more at home in the straight world than in the gay world the few times I had any exposure to it. But I actually wrote David Kopay, the former NFL football player, a letter, care of Washington Star, when he came out publicly. And I had played college football, track, and rugby. And I couldn't be gay because there aren't gay football players. And then when I came out of college and saw Kopay's coming out, I was like, oh my God, there's an athlete who's gay. Maybe that means I'm gay too, because I was able to say I'm not really gay because until that. So I wrote him a letter, and he answered it and invited me out for a drink and became a lifelong bar buddy, a mentor of sorts. And that was when I first began to reshape my configuration of what it meant to be gay, because football players couldn't go with dancers, but they did. And so that's when I began to come out. It was a several year stretch of really hiding in the straight world on Wall Street, and all my straight friends. But gradually I began to come out, and 1979 was the year I drove cross country, trying to find myself. Spent the summer here in San Diego, had a great romance, came back to New York, and I was full steam ahead from that point on. But for me, the bars were, I don't know, they were kind of what you wanted them to be. They were a little bit of everything. And I had some that I found favorites, and others I didn't particularly like. But there was never a gay bar that I wouldn't go into if I was around it, because it was like a beacon of safety. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, it was like a kid in a candy store. Once you had tasted that first treat, you're like, okay, I want to sample these other options on the menu until I find the one that I really like, or the ones that I really like. And I would have to agree with that, because even though the Hippo was my initial experience, and, will always have a special place in my heart. I was going to school in Nashville, and I discovered several bars there, including the Warehouse 28, which was an iconic Nashville bar that lasted, I think, about 20 years. And the one of the remaining founder, Michael Dolly Wilson, just passed away a few days ago. So there's been a lot of conversation about the bar, but it's one of the few places that really cemented the idea that not only were the bars places to socialize and have a cocktail, but they were our community centers. They had so much of an impact on organizing, the various protests and affiliation groups that we have, in raising money for causes like HIV and AIDS, and for building a true sense of community. And I think that will, always be the case, that we'll always have those memories of those places, of being more than just a place to go grab a beer.
You could probably say that AIDS was the galvanizing force in a lot of places, right?
Yes, I think so. It was a little before David's time in the gay bar scene, but yeah, depending on where you were, I was living in the South at the time, and the real news of AIDS didn't hit the South until probably the mid 80s. In the early 80s, it was a New York, San Francisco problem. Gays in the South largely thought, oh, this is, something weird that's going on in these bathhouses and brothels in New York City or San Francisco. But yes, once the AIDS epidemic really started to hit full swing, it made a big difference in the way we interacted in and out of the bars.
Well,
I totally agree. In my experience, starting to go out, like starting in 1990, I mean, that was still the peak of the AIDS crisis. I mean, we have to remember that was a time when if you tested HIV positive, it was tantamount to a death sentence. The protease inhibitor based cocktails didn't get approved until 1995, and they weren't in widespread use till later. So really, like at the end of the 80s, especially in the beginning of the 90s, it was very scary to be gay. And so, the LGBTQ community had to band together to create like a political force. I mean, that, in the late 1980s, groups like ACT UP and GMHC were formed to help demand funding for treatment research and social services for people with HIV/AIDS.
it was Elizabeth Taylor, AMFAR.
Yeah, exactly. And so the bars and clubs, they became these safe havens. And as Art said, it was all about building community. And you were just kind of like shell shocked. It was a trauma and a collective trauma. And so we gathered at these clubs as much to support each other and love each other, but also they did offer safe sex education. I mean, you got free condoms. I mean, like even a few years before, no one would ever think about using condoms. I mean, but that's what we had to do for a long, long time. And so, yeah, if you went out to the clubs, I'll talk about this later. I had this collection of club flyers, and a good portion of them say it's a benefit for AMFAR or GMHC or ACT UP or LifeBeat. So it was about raising funds for these groups to help solve the problem.
Right. And not only that, but from what I witnessed anyway, it also kind of solidified the community. So prior to that happening in the mid to late 80s, there were a lot of splinter groups in the gay community. You had, leather and macho bars, you had the country western bars, you had the pretty boy bars, you had the snooty white boy bars, and they were in the lesbian bars. They were all kind of separate, and people didn't cross those lines. Once we got into having to deal with HIV and AIDS, we started to see these groups coming together, and the bears and the leather groups and the lesbians all banded together with the rest of the, what we then called the gay community, and worked together to provide treatment, to raise money, and to take care of the people who were, who were dying in front of us.
I think not a lot of people are fully aware of a couple of things. Number one, women, lesbians, dug in and helped in every way they could, wherever they could. It was amazing. They didn't need to. We had never been very nice towards them. They were excluded out of a lot of things in the late 60s and early 70s. But something innate about them, and the fact that some of their friends were gay men, they became nursemaids. They became, I don't know what a handmaiden is, but, people who took care of people's needs. And frankly, it's hard to believe we would have achieved as much progress as quickly as we did if it hadn't been for women.
One person in particular that comes to my mind, I was living in Atlanta by the mid 80s, and there was a bar owner there, a lesbian, who had owned several bars over the years. Her name is Dina Collins, and she would actually spend the night at her bar after closing so that she could be there at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning to provide breakfast and showers and assistance for people suffering with HIV and AIDS. And she was a lesbian. And that was just one example of how, a woman in the community took it upon herself to use her bar and her connections to help the community, which probably would not have happened 5 or 10 years earlier.
The other thing is kind of in the opposite direction. The perception is AIDS came on July 3rd, 1981, and rushed in like a tsunami. In point of fact, it was much more underhanded than that. People have been discovered with cultures of AIDS from in the 70s and even late 60s that still were valid in 1981 when AIDS came out. So it had been percolating in our blood supply carefully for a while, but then a lot of sexual activity that gay men engaged in helped jar it loose. And as we began to do that, so I was on Wall Street, I was closeted, and I wouldn't be caught dead anywhere where people would know I was gay. And so the result was I didn't go out very often to Infinity and Flamingo and 12 West and the Saint I went to a few times. But basically, I steered clear of those places. And the people I do know, and this is maybe not fair, but it seems like a lot of the people who went regularly every weekend night and did drugs regularly and often had sex, that the accumulus of people that contracted HIV were more in that camp. Look, there are people who got it from having sex one time. Nobody's placing blame or lack of blame. I'm just saying if you're in the maelstrom of that kind of activity, it should not have been a surprise when it did happen. Then there were people like me who went out, if we went out at all, on a weekend night, and we didn't do drugs usually. And, we were a little bit less pushing our boundaries. And I don't know anybody in my set who came down with AIDS and either acknowledged it or didn't, and passed away until 1986. All the people I knew passed away from 86 to 90 something. The people who were dying up until 86, many of them were those who had been hard nightlife partiers. So it's not in any way assign blame or a lack of blame. It's just we didn't know then what that kind of behavior might induce in us. So I just think people aren't fully aware of the pace at which AIDS took place. It started slow, it grew, and then suddenly by the late 80s and 90s, it was everywhere.
Yeah, and another thing you have to remember, it's just like any disease. The first case is only going to come when you test for that particular disease. So if somebody died from AIDS in 1974, they would have been diagnosed as dying from pneumonia or some other, illness that would not show up in the records as HIV because they weren't aware of that as a possible diagnosis. Now, to your point about, the party animal and the promiscuous people in the scene, I kind of wonder, I don't know if there's ever been a study done, but I was pretty active and pretty promiscuous in the late 70s, early 80s. I mean, there were weekends where I had multiple sexual partners the same day and didn't even know their names and didn't care. But I was fortunate enough to have made it through 40 plus years of not being positive. And I think part of that may have had to do with the choice of partners and choice of activities too. I was always partial to younger guys. So the likelihood when I was 24 of sleeping with a 21-year-old who was HIV positive was pretty slim because they didn't have hundreds of partners at that point. Whereas if I were sleeping with somebody who was 40 years old and had 15 years or 10 years of experience in unprotected gay sex, I would be more likely to be exposed to it. So I think that might have played a role too, is, who your preferred partner was and what degree of sexual activity you were involved in.
I hung out with 3 guys for a while in my bank, and each of them were division heads, Latin America, Africa, etc. And they were all gay. And that's when I just started to come out and learn who was gay. And one of the 3 was enamored of me, so I got included. And I went with them a few times for drinks. And one night, one of the 3 volunteered that he had sex with 27 guys the past weekend. I didn't get an accounting of what happened, but I guess it was a lot of glory hole activity. But it doesn't matter, just the fact that he was counting and that there were a lot of people doing that.
Well, I was just wondering if we wanted to move on and talk about our favorite gay bars.
Sure. Why don't you start?
As I mentioned, my heyday of going out was in New York in the 90s. And this was when there was an explosion of queer nightlife. And so I loved not only did I like the larger dance clubs, like I said, the Roxy, there was a place called Limelight in an old 1850s Romanesque church. There was the Palladium, the Tunnel, Sound Factory, and Twilo. So those were some of the big dance clubs, but it was also great to go to some of the smaller spaces like Splash, Sound Factory Bar, Uncle Charlie's, Pyramid Club were also a blast. And I loved Uncle Charlie's because it was down in the Village on Greenwich Avenue, and they played the latest music videos on a large screen. So you could, like, if Madonna's Vogue was on the screen, like, you could use that as an excuse to like talk to the guy next to you. So I actually really love video bars. And Splash also had a lot of videos. But so Uncle Charlie's, it also had one of these large curved bars. So like you go and you'd order a drink, and you could kind of, like, while you're waiting for your drink, you can look across at the guy who's on the other side of the bar facing you. So you were like, you could make eye contact and then maybe go over and talk to them later. So I sort of like that whole semicircle gay bar. And the space is actually now a restaurant. But I popped in there the other day, and they still actually have that original Uncle Charlie's curved bar. So I like that they kept that.
And it's not Fuddruckers, is it?
Yeah, it's called Fiddlesticks. Close, yeah. And then another legendary spot was the Roseland Ballroom in Hell's Kitchen. And they hosted the infamous Black Party, which was put on by the Saint at Large. And that was an offshoot of the infamous Saint Club in the East Village. That was more in the 80s. So anyway, the Roseland held over 5,000 revelers at once. And it was a black party, so they were all dressed in leather chaps, leather harnesses, and it had live sex shows and a steamy back room. And it was a hugely popular circuit party because it attracted people not just from New York, not just from the US, but actually from all over the world. Guys would like book their flights to go into New York just to attend the black party. And what is also interesting is that, even still to this, just like a couple months ago, there was another black party held in New York City in Manhattan. It was a much smaller venue. I didn't go, I was out of town, it still carries on the spirit of these sane at large black parties. Yeah, and so they also held several parties throughout the year, not just the black party, but the Saint at Large held the white party, Halloween party, and even this this poster behind me, that's promoting the 1994 New Year's Eve party that Saint at Large also had.
What
So
did
those
you
were
say
Saint
those men was an offshoot
of the Saint.
Okay.
Yeah, the Saint, once the Saint closed in the 80s, they still kind of kept the spirit alive by saying, "Hey, let's start doing these, regular parties that were ended up becoming circuit parties." And so they wanted to capture the spirit of what the parties were at the Saint because they had black parties at the original Saint and white parties. And so it's the spirit is still, it's changed and it's evolved, but it's still alive.
I think
Right, and it's known as the Saint at Large, correct?
Yes.
I think the original Saint was like Fillmore East or something. It was like,
Yeah, that space, it was the Fillmore East, and it was for like that only was good for like maybe 3 years, and then the Saint came in. Bruce Mailman owned the St. Mark's Bass and made so much money that he had literally millions of dollars to gut the entire space and turn it into this fantastical gay mecca of dance. And they had, I'm sure you've heard this story before, where I was only there once in the late 80s, and it had a planetarium dome that was over the dance floor so they could project all kinds of light shows. And it was mind blowing.
I went a number of times. I'm one of the people that didn't really like it because it was so cold and unemotional. Whereas I love Studio 54. Did either of you ever manage to make it there?
I didn't get in. I waited in line.
Oh, you were probably too young then.
Oh.
Anyway, I was there on Halloween 1977, and another time I went with Ricky Arnez Jr. So we got out of the cab and the seas parted. So, but it was a lot of fun, and it was just a warmer, and of course, straights and gays and drugs and alcohol and a little bit of everything.
What about you, Art? Did you have any favorite night spots?
Yeah, as I kind of mentioned earlier when I was talking about the Hippo, there were several bars that really, kind of wowed me. And it was because they were not dark, dingy holes in the wall. Just like many of the ones that you mentioned, Limelight, Palladium, Tunnel, Roxy, they made you feel important. They made you feel worthy of being in a proper space, not relegated to somebody's, lean-to shack in the backyard. It was a proper bar. You were proud to be there. You were amazed by, the sound and the lights and the architecture that was put into it. And so I had similar experiences being mostly living in the South. One that really stands out is Backstreet Atlanta. It opened in 1975 and it lasted until 2004. New Year's Eve of 2005, they closed at midnight by law. They were required to because the city wouldn't renew their license. For the last half of its life, it was a 24-hour a day, always open, always serving alcohol bar. 3 stories, massive dance floor, huge cabaret upstairs, and crazy busy between 3 o'clock in the morning and like 9 o'clock in the morning on weekends, because there was nowhere else to go if you wanted to go out.
Was it
And to
legal
me, that
beer 24 hours a day at that time?
no, yes, there were 3 or 4 bars in Atlanta that had a special 24-hour liquor license, and they were grandfathered in once you had gotten them. But there was one caveat. If you ever closed the bar, if you ever locked that front door and had nobody on duty and didn't allow customers in, if you did it for half an hour, you were done. You went back to a normal liquor license. So for like 15 years, that bar operated around the clock all the time. Um, and it was really kind of an amazing experience. So that was one that really stands out. Of course, the Hippo in Baltimore for being my first. Um, the Copa in Fort Lauderdale, that was another iconic bar. And these bars, one thing that was really impressive about them, and you got to remember, we're talking about going back to like the 80s. We're not talking about recent times, but they would have people like Madonna come in and perform live in the bar because she wasn't the huge international star that she is now. So she would perform at places like the Copa. You would see Sylvester and Two Tons of Fun, who were later known as the Weather Girls.
Girls, yeah.
You'd see all kind of performers in there, and that made you feel really special because here you are, in a gay bar as a gay person, not really being widely accepted in the world yet, and yet you're going into this fabulous place with an amazing sound and light system, and you're seeing top-notch celebrities. It's not like you're seeing, some local guitar player sitting up on a bar stool by himself. This is like traveling talent. Grace Jones performed at these bars. It was just amazing. Bette Midler obviously got her start in the Continental Bathhouse in New York. So it was kind of special. And of course, Lost and Found in DC was another one. That was another great bar that for its time, if I remember correctly, Lost and Found even had kind of like white linen tablecloth service. They had a proper restaurant that served quality food. It wasn't bar food like burgers and onion rings. It was, good quality food. So those kind of bars are some of my favorites, but there were also some niche bars. And I know there were bars like this in other cities. One of my favorites in Atlanta is a bar that was called Far Library. And the entire inside of the bar was bookshelves around the walls, and it was full of books, actual books. And they had like lounge seating, sofas covered in velvet in different places, a slightly sunken dance floor, a big outdoor patio. And instead of being on a back road or a grungy industrial neighborhood, it was in the heart of Atlanta's Buckhead district, on the ground floor of a high rent office building that had doctors and lawyers and psychiatrists and accountants in the offices upstairs. And at night, the ground floor, one half of it turned into this crazy gay bar. So, that kind of holds a special place too.
I came out at the Lost and Found, uh, but simultaneously at the Pier 9. Had you heard of that?
Yes, of course.
Well, for me, I like the Lost and Found a lot, but the unalloyed gayness, meaning the fact it was all men all the time, versus studio. I'm blanking on the other name. The other bar was mixed, men and women.
Nine?
Pier 9, thank you. And so they were next door to each other. They're both on Half Street in Southwest. And you basically walk between them. And I've always liked having something that's pretty intense and then something that's a little bit more at ease.
And if I remember my bar history correctly, one of the big claims to fame of Pier 9 was that they invested a ton of money in a state-of-the-art sound and light system, that it wasn't just a local neighborhood bar, but they actually put big money into it when, the disco scene started heating up.
Well, it was huge and it was fun. Are there any clubs and out of the way places that you've enjoyed? Not your main cities.
Hmm. Um, there was a club in I believe it was Charlotte. I want to say Charlotte, North Carolina. I could be wrong. That was called the Castle, and I had gone there with some friends. It was only a few hours from Atlanta. I've been staying with friends in South Carolina, and we went up to this bar. And the thing to me that was so memorable about it was that it was because it's in a small area, and it doesn't have a big assortment of gay venues at the time. It was extremely mixed, like you're saying with the Pier 9, men and women of all stripes and colors in the bar. Um, and it was very community oriented. It's like people set aside their differences and seemed to really like each other because that was their collective safe haven from that area. And the same was true of Alan Gold's in Chattanooga. Alan Gold's was a long running club in Chattanooga, which is roughly halfway between Atlanta and Nashville. So in Nashville, you have a dozen or so gay bars at the time. In Atlanta, you have 25, 30 gay bars to go to. But in the middle, Chattanooga was basically, Alan Gold's was their go to. And it was the same way. It had that small town sense of familiarity and concern for each other and community that you didn't necessarily find in the bigger city bars where there were, a little bit more cliquish and um, a little different.
Are there any trends that you notice taking place now in gay bar land?
Um, yes. One thing that I'm finding a lot, especially in the new bars that are opening or the bars that are coming under new ownership, is um, while the owners are committed to providing a safe space for what we now call the LGBTQ community, um, they are making greater efforts to be very inclusive. So, as opposed to the old days when you had a bar open up and it was mainly a certain type of person, it was mainly, you know, macho guys in leather or, you know, country western white guys with cowboy boots or, you know, preppy professionals. Now we're starting to see more diversity intentionally in the bar. There's a couple of examples that come to mind. One just opened last month. It's called Q in Kansas City, and the owner of that bar, Lance Pierce, has gone out of his way to make it welcoming to everyone. So you walk in, there's a variety of employees. They're not just hiring tall, skinny, pretty white boys. Um, there's, lesbians, there's trans people, there's bi people, there's gay guys of all different nationalities, and um, which, kind of gives you that image of inclusivity from the get go. They support events for all these different factions of the community. They do things that appeal to one group or another. They have rooms in the bar that have either muffled sound. So people who have sound sensitivities and don't like being around loud, clashing noises can go in there and have a conversation and a cocktail without freaking out. They have places that have less strobe lights and flashing lights for people who are sensitive to that. Um, so they've gone all out. And the same is true of a bar that's called As You Are Bar in DC, which was opened by two women, but with the same mission. They don't want it to be called a lesbian bar. They don't want it to be a queer bar. Everybody is welcome. Whoever you are, if you respect the other people there, you're welcome to be there. And they too have a very diverse staff. So I think that's the trend I'm seeing is not so much these little cubbyhole concepts of we only want big butch dykes in here in motorcycle jackets, or we only want skinny white twinks. It's everybody's welcome. Everybody can play together.
I've noticed a couple of trends, in New York, that I think could be extended to other areas of the country. The first one is, I mean, and we take it for granted now, but like every bar pretty much has a drag show. Like you can't go into New York without seeing drag queens, and that simply it was much more underground and more specialized back in the 80s and certainly the 90s, where yes, you'd have like the Pyramid, Barracuda, and Boy Bar. Those were like the real drag centric bars with performers. But now, I mean, it's almost like they need to have it because it's so popular. And so I'd say that's one trend. Another trend is back rooms are very much back in force in New York. A lot of the especially the dance nights that they have. Maybe a lot of the clubs have moved from Manhattan to the outer boroughs, such as Brooklyn or Queens. But you can't there's back rooms in every big dance club, and so that's something that I feel like you didn't see as often, but in the 80s and 90s.
Does that mean the city is less, patrolling the grounds, or is
Well, I mean, you don't, first of all, thankfully, there are drugs that help prevent even getting HIV, PrEP. So people are much, much more, they're less guarded than they used to be. And so it's culturally become, more acceptable. I mean, they have like underwear parties, like um, the what's it called? The Red Room. And so that's, yeah, it's they've just they've relaxed the standards because the health risks aren't quite as great as they were before.
Do you mean the Red Eye?
Yeah, I'm sorry, the Red Eye, yes.
It's in Hell's Kitchen, over by the bus station, right?
Yeah.
It's run by Daniel Nardicchio,
Yeah.
who is famous for organizing the underwear parties on Fire Island for the last 25 years.
Right.
And he has kind of a creative take on how he does things. He has a theme night there that he calls The Devil Wears Nada.
Right.
And they have a clothes check at the front of the bar. And I think which of course will be in the past, but for Easter Sunday, he's got a hunky Jesus contest, which is a little off the beaten path. He's trying to not duplicate what every other bar does,
Yeah.
Thirsty Thursday or whatever. He's trying to come up with his own creative interpretations of promotions.
so? What do we think the future of these spaces are? Unlimited? We're just not clear which direction it's going to go in, or have you noticed any trends already?
Well, one thing I want to mention that none of us have mentioned so far, but in addition to the change toward more diversity, we're also seeing embracing non-alcohol consumption. So a lot of these bars, Red Eye, for example, in New York, has a coffee bar right up front, and you can go in there and order a whole slew of either mocktails or fancy coffee drinks. They're open during the day, so you can go in there before lunch and study or use their internet or have a cup of coffee. And we're seeing more and more bars that are adding juice bars or expanded non-alcoholic selections because of two reasons. One, I think, is that we've gotten a negative rep for being alcoholics. Everybody wants to think of, gays go out and drink 7 or 8 nights a week. But the other thing is that people are a little more health conscious and maybe they don't want to have a drink. They don't want to have alcohol every night, but they want to enjoy the company and have a place to hang out. And so I think we're seeing that more. As I mentioned, As You Are Bar in DC does that too. And a lot of times they have a small kitchen with light bites or, bar snacks, to embrace the people in the community that don't want to go out and drink, or who are recovering alcoholics, or, just not interested in drinking every day. Are you
Yeah,
seeing that?
there was actually, yes, and there was actually an article in the New York Times talking about that, and I definitely see that. The one thing that component that I believe is also happening is that people with the availability of like edibles, like people don't need to have alcohol. They can just pop a half of an edible, and that's, you know, that. So yeah, they don't do alcohol, but they might do other things.
Right. But it's changing the face of the bar, because now you can see people in there, who maybe wouldn't have gone in the bar, because they don't like to drink, or whatever the case is. And they can now go in the middle of the afternoon at 2 o'clock and have a cup of coffee with a couple of friends and feel at home, and not feel like they're, being looked down upon for not drinking.
Right.
Are you seeing that at all, Mike? Or
I haven't noticed that in the bars here.
you're on the West Coast, right? San Diego?
Yeah, San Diego. There's 3 or 4 bars that are pretty much always crowded. One's a dance bar, one's a cruise bar. There's a bar for kind of guys my age, not all as old as me, but 40s on up, called the Loft. So a lot of nice, comfortable spaces to hang out at. But I really haven't. I mean, if I go to the Loft, I may get something non-alcoholic. Nobody cares. So, David, before we get towards the end of the program, I wanted to ask you to share with our audience what we all already know, which is how you came out, or the process of coming out, and what that eventually led to.
Yeah, no, I mean, when I went out in the 90s, when it was time to leave, there were promoters standing at the exits handing out printed flyers advertising the next week's parties. And so most people would throw them on the sidewalk. And there's an example right there. And that's from the book that I published last year called Getting In. And what I did was, when everyone else was throwing out these paper flyers onto the sidewalk, because everything was so new to me and exciting, and I was just coming out, like, I'm like, how could you throw these out? There's like really cool images of drag queens and club kids and shirtless hunks. And I liked them. So I just started grabbing them, and then I got on mailing lists, and I would go into queer bookstores that had stacks of them, and queer clothing stores. And I eventually had amassed this collection of 1,200 of these printed club flyers. And friends were telling me, I've got to share these with other people, because nowadays, as I'm sure you know, they do very few printed flyers. Most everything is digital. And they just have a different quality about them, that I think that they were much more clever and had more grits to them in some cases in the 90s. So I developed this book. It's a coffee table style book with over 200 of my favorites. And I got to interview a lot of the people whose names are on these club flyers, such as drag queens like Lady Bunny and Linda Simpson, DJs like Susan Morabito and Max Rodriguez, who are also both still in the scene now as well. And I even interviewed, there's this really hot go-go guy. His name's Mark Allen from the 90s. And I had such a huge crush on him. And it was so fun getting in touch with him and having an interview like this with this guy I had such a crush on. And so he was so articulate. And also I was really fortunate to have sort of culture maven journalist from the Village Voice, Michael Musto, who has been chronicling queer nightlife in New York City from the 80s to today. And so he wrote the foreword of the book to kind of sort of give an overview of why the 90s was especially a unique time in LGBTQ nightlife. So I really I came out with the book, and it's doing much better than we expected. The New York Times did an article about it, and we're in our third printing, and I'm just so thrilled to share this sort of forgotten, what could be a forgotten lost chapter in queer nightlife with the rest of the world.
Well, in June 2019, they had an evening at the New York Historical Society, which was all about celebration of Stonewall 50. And they had a lot of historic figures and items. For example, I don't know, I think all of you know, but Rollerina. Everybody remember Rollerina?
She was there.
A mild-mannered stockbroker by day who dressed in a fairy god another kind of majorette suit with a wand, and she looked like I don't know what the word is, apparition, just kind of flying through the streets. She would go into Alexander's or Bloomingdale's in her rollerblades and go up the stairs, and she all over town. You could see her anywhere. Well, she's long been retired, but somehow they tracked her down. She's kind of not very much into publicity. Of course, I wanted to interview her. She had no interest, but she handed in her skates and her wand and her majorette's uniform, and all that was in a glass cabinet at the New York Historical Society event, as was David's collection of posters. So there is some value in history, right?
I agree. I think it's really important that there are so many people out there, because nobody can do the job themselves to preserve our history, and it's been neglected for so long that it's really a relief to see how many different people there are out there that are either historians or authors who are preserving parts of our history so that future generations will have it documented. And I'm so grateful to people like you for, doing your part in it so that I can do my part. I mean, it's a collaborative effort, and it's so good to see that happening.
Oh, thank you. Yes, no, and I've it's so gratifying. I mean, believe me, if it's not a money-making venture, it's definitely a passion project. And to me, the reward is people. I get emails. I've had people stop me on the street saying, "Guy that did that book, we have it on our coffee table, nostalgia." And people, if I post something online, a lot of people will respond, like remembering, oh wow, I was there at the tunnel that night. So yeah, it's really something. And Art, I love your project of all the logos of all of the gay bars and spaces over the years. I think it's like, I want to get a whole bunch of t-shirts with those logos on it.
I've been working on it the last couple of weeks again, pretty diligently, because a friend of mine had given me a 1980 Dameron's guide. And it was sitting on my desk, and I picked it up a couple weeks ago and started flipping through it more, attentively. And I realized how many ads were in there for bars that I had not been able to find logos for. So I went through and added all of those logos to my current slideshow, which now has, I think, 4,500 gay bar logos, mostly from the US, some international locations, but mostly the US. And every time I see a new one, it puts a smile on my face. It speaks to the, that memory of those places. And like your book, one thing that you kind of alluded to, today, everything is digital. Even if it's a print ad, it's been produced digitally. They've used, Adobe Illustrator or some other graphics program to create it. But so many of the ones that you have were done old school way, either cut and paste or hand-drawn images, hand-lettered, and they have a unique characteristic that represents the individual spaces. Now, a lot of the bars, if you blocked off the name of the bar on the ad, you wouldn't know what bar it was for, because they use this very similar, hunky guy images or drag queen pictures or whatever. And a lot of the same themes. But back then, you had an actual local artist or, hobbyist drawing out a picture of something and making some crazy looking lettering to invite you to next Thursday's party at the Limelight. And so they had a lot of character and a lot of, they're, it's a lot different than what we see today. And I think that makes you appreciate it even more.
I think that's a really great point. I think what people don't realize is back then, not all, there were some of them that were, especially the Roxy, where the models were shot by professional photographers in photography studios, and the models were paid and the photographers were hired by the promoter. And so they were works of art. Like they had a whole concept. Like they didn't just like shoot hot guys. Like a lot of them it was thought out before the photo shoot happened. And so they were, I mean, I saw them as mini works of art, which that's why I thought it was more shocking that people would just throw them away. But yeah, it's different nowadays. I mean, it's just, they'll maybe whatever person's designing the digital invitation just swipes it from the internet, or AI or whatever that they do. But it just, it doesn't quite have the same authenticity as before.
You also don't see as many real invitations as before. At least I know.
Right. I mean, online, I see quite a few digital ones, but not the printed ones.
Right.
Definitely made a big change in our community as far as how we present it, because so much of it is digital now.
Yeah,
it's not the same degree of intimacy, and I think it might also stifle some of the creativity, because somebody who's in Des Moines can find an ad online for a gay bar in New York City or San Diego or Miami, and they can copy the whole concept, the theme, the name of the promotion, whatever. And so instead of coming up with original events for each individual venue, they're kind of piggybacking on, Thirsty Thursdays. That sounds cool. Let's do that everywhere. And, it loses that creativity, because back in the 80s and 90s, it wasn't so easy to do that. And you weren't going to copy the bar next door, because that would be, blatantly obvious. So.
Do you ever find yourself running into particularly younger people who say, oh, gay bars aren't important. We don't need them, or it doesn't matter?
Yes. I do see that, but I'm seeing that start to change. So, in the early days of COVID, people still had kind of a negative attitude about the bars, especially the up and coming, the younger group, because they had so many other options. They had affinity groups in high school and college that they could belong to. They had online apps where they could connect with other people in the LGBT community. But I think two things kind of came into play, in my opinion. I'd love to hear David's opinion on this. But so the first thing to me that came into play was we had a couple of years of limited access to gay bars because of COVID, varying degrees in different cities depending on how they enforced the rules, but you were kind of forced to stay home. So when that ended, when they lifted the ban on these places being open, I think a lot of people suddenly realized, you don't miss it until it's gone. And they said, wait, we haven't been able to go to a bar for 2 years. We're going out. And that started a little bit of, an uptick in the gay bar scene. But then I think the other thing that happened is more recently, particularly with these attempts by numerous red states and now the federal government to limit our rights and to persecute us for things that we have taken for granted over the last 5 or 10, 15 years. People have realized that it's much easier to make that bond with somebody in person. If you go to a bar and you meet 4 or 5 like-minded people, you can have a nice, productive conversation about how are we going to combat this? How are we going to overcome these issues? Doing it online, it tends to get, I think, very catty, and you get a lot of people with the opposing view who want to come in and stir the pot and, and make the issue one of kind of hatred and conflict instead of how are we going to resolve this. So I think today what we're seeing is that the bars now, people are going because they do appreciate the loss of the bars during COVID, and they want to communicate in person. They don't like being boarded up in their room or their house or whatever for months on end. And because there is a common cause again, which we kind of lost after marriage equality, it became, we were kind of laid back and didn't care as much. Now we're realizing all of this could go away and we'll be right back in the same spot we were when Stonewall happened. So I think that's part of it too. Have you seen that?
Those are, yeah, those are two really great points. I during COVID, obviously, sadly, a few places had to shutter, and yeah, we were quarantined basically, so in lockdown. But yeah, I know in New York, especially Hell's Kitchen, like within a year, I think there were 5 new gay bars, and a lot of them were interesting because they were and I mean LGBTQ. I mean, they were definitely much more inclusive, and they had different floors and different spaces. So one was the more the bar area, one was the performance area, one was the sex area. So they've kind of become little mini marts, I guess. But yeah, so that was very much. I thought that there was a surge after COVID went away. But what I am also thinking about was there's also that period before COVID for like a few years where I don't know if you recall, but people were declaring the death of the gay bar because of the hookup apps. Because it's like, oh, you don't need to go out to a bar to meet someone to have sex anymore. You just can stay on your couch, get on your phone and order someone in, so that. And then some bars started closing down. And so that was one factor, but then luckily, I think it went in like a cycle. And then that I feel that now people have rediscovered the importance of being in the physical space next to each other. As you said, especially nowadays with the threats of our rights being taken away, it's important to be physically in the same space.
I have run into a lot of young people over the years, and sometimes we'll have the conversation, how important is the gay bar or lesbian bar? And do you think we'd miss it if it weren't here? And some people honestly think there's no need. But inevitably we get down to the point where I try to give the example that, let's say you're a married guy and you've got a husband and a kid or 2, and you join the country club in the suburb where you live, and you go there to show up one day, and your husband's parking the car and you've got the kid or kids, and some greeter walks up, or a woman or a husband. Oh, what the darling child, how are you? Where's your wife? And you're put in the position of having to say, I'm not married, I'm gay. And that may not sound like a lot, but when you're not looking for that, the idea that anywhere we go, we might have to deal with that is not a lot of fun. So the reason we want a gay bar is to go somewhere, to be able to go somewhere where everyone else is just like you. And they understand, having gone through their own coming out process, and maturation, what you're going through or went through, and you just relate to each other eye to eye because of that shared experience. And so, because I will have people say, why do we need it? I mean, blacks need it, Jews need it. Well, if blacks and Jews and women need it, why don't gay men need it? There are sometimes, or lesbians, where we need to be among our own kind and just commune and not have to talk about it. But if you go to a place like a country club, you're automatically going to be faced with that decision to come out over and over and over again when you're not ready.
Well, and the other thing too that going to your point about some of the minority groups is that, most of these minorities now can go pretty much anywhere they want to go. I mean, they're not restricted like they were, in the 40s and 50s where blacks couldn't use that water fountain or whatever. But we still see things like cultural community centers. Like I live in Tampa, and in Tampa, there's a pretty large population of people from India. And we have an Indian cultural center where they hold Indian weddings and Indian feasts for different celebrations that they have and so on. And they wear their ceremonial robes and everything and live like their culture, embrace their culture. And the same is true of other groups. You see, Italian American clubs and German American clubs and Cuban American clubs in Tampa, because even though you're accepted in mainstream society in the broader group, you still want to connect with your roots. And that's part of what I think the gay bars community can do, is it helps you understand what your community specifically is like and helps you discuss. You're not going to walk into a TGI Friday and ask the person at the next table, questions about, well, how did you get through this, gay marriage situation if you don't know if they're gay, or how do you address these issues that are somewhat unique to our community if you don't have a community center? And that's really what these bars have kind of always been. And especially today, as David said earlier as well, with the challenges we're facing politically, I think it's becoming more important, and the younger people are starting to realize that not only can they reach people face to face, but they see a different spectrum than might be in their group. Their group might be all 21 to 28-year-old people living in the northwest part of town, but if they go to a bar, they're going to see 21 to 81-year-old people that live all over, and some that are tourists. So it's a different encounter.
Yeah. Also, getting back, Mike, to what you said, that there are some people that feel that gay bars aren't necessary anymore, or gay spaces. And I'll use the example of a club. Is there is at least one party called Horse Meat Disco, which is at the Knockdown Center in sort of Brooklyn, Queens. And it's a huge space, and it's maybe 4 to 6 times a year. And that sells out within minutes when the tickets go on sale. So obviously, there's still very much a segment of the LGBT population that really values the idea of dancing and communing with like-minded people. And it is, I mean, I've been a couple times, and it definitely feels like it's 95% gay men.
What is the focus of the event again?
Dancing. It's retro disco. A lot of it's sort of remixed disco from the 70s and 80s. So it's more accessible music that has words, because a lot of times if you were to go out nowadays, it's not melody or words necessarily. And so it's a fun dance experience, and it does skew. I mean, it's all over. It's young people, and it's people my age, believe it or not. And so but the fact that something would sell out like so quickly, like within an hour, speaks to that there's still a need.
How do you find out when the tickets becoming available?
It's like people, I have younger people that will email me saying, okay, they're on sale. Yeah. Because I'm not so so plugged in anymore. You have to be on the right list.
Where is the venue?
It's called the Knockdown Center. It's sort of like on the edge of Brooklyn.
So what's a good way to wrap up this session, would you say? Any thoughts for the future?
Well, I feel like we covered it in a way.
I think everybody that's listening to this should find out what is available near them as far as LGBTQ venues, and take a couple of friends and go experience one of them. Even if they haven't been to a bar in 10 years, go find one that's near you, or when you're on vacation, and check it out and see what the scene is like now and how much it's changed, and see if you find something there that can kind of appeal to you and enhance your life a little bit. Because if you haven't been in 20 years, you're missing out on something. You haven't seen.
If there's some kind of walkathon between bars in any city that might be constructed.
I see them all the time, but to me, I typically don't go to them, because to me, what the concept seems to be is, let's do this bar hop in, say, 2 or 3 hours time and visit 6 bars. Well, I'm really not interested at my age in having 6 drinks in 3 hours while I'm walking with a group of people down the street. But it does give you exposure to the venues. I just think that maybe should be less alcohol centric. And, but that, that's just my opinion. I'm sure the bar owners prefer that they consume alcohol.
Well, I believe there's always going to be queer spaces. I can't predict what form they'll be in the future. And as we touched upon, perhaps now that the far right is waging this cultural backlash against the LGBTQ community, I think we're going to need to band together, and these night spots can play a big role now as they have in the past.
We have to find the backbone we did during ACT UP.
Yeah,
it's hard to do when it's not necessarily leading to death.
Well, I think we've seen a spike in the number of, I'm going to use the term gay because that's what I've always used, but in the world of gay spaces, I think we've always seen spikes when we've been repressed the most. So, in the 60s, you had some uprisings because it was illegal to be gay. It was illegal to hold hands with a guy in a bar. It was illegal to dance with a guy in a bar. And then we saw Stonewall, and we got a little bit of a kick in the pants and started banding together and fighting for our rights. And then in the mid to late 80s, we had AIDS come in, and we got pushed back again, and we had people look down on us, and we felt like a secondhand, thirdhand class community, and we fought back. And now it's happening again. And I think this is going to be a kind of a little impetus for another kickstart to some growth in the LGBT community. And as David said, I don't know what form it will be, if it'll be more community centers and more coffee shops and things of that nature. But I think we're going to continue to have queer safe spaces and see some growth in that department in the next, at least 10, 12 years.
From your lips to God's ears. Well, thank you both for joining. When it's ready, Henry will send it to you. And it's always great to see you both.